Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. The radio and TV version of the show air in over 12 states. This includes both coasts and Silicon Valley. The show also airs in the UK, Caribbean, and Australia. For full show times, plus past episodes of the TV and radio show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. We just launched a free online community to connect past guests, listeners, and others. This community will allow you to network, chat on Slack, or get help with anything else, and a lot more. If you're interested in joining the community, buying some merch, sponsoring the show, or signing up for the newsletter, please go to buildingthefutureshow.com. I want to invite all of you in the Building the Future community to join me at SUPEX, the Startup Expo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, this July 26th, where I'll be the MC. SUPEX is one of the largest and best startup conferences in the US and the official gathering of the Building the Future community this summer. SUPEX has cutting-edge content, a cool startup competition, and a half-day forum this year called #WomenForWomen, the largest gathering in the US in 2018 of angel groups, seed funds, and VC funds focused on female founders and female entrepreneurs. For more information, visit www.sup-x.org. I hope to see all my Building the Future friends there. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Steve Wells. He's a global futurist, keynote speaker, and the COO of Fast Future. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much indeed, Kevin. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. I'm always kind of fascinated by the future, I guess. But maybe before we get into all that kind of fun stuff, let's get to know you a little bit better and start off with where you grew up.
Yeah, I grew up in East Kent in England, round about 70 miles from London, quite close to the beach.
Nice.
I went to school there. When I started work round about 10, 15 miles away from where I lived.
Okay.
After that, I actually worked for a UK affiliate of an American company, Pfizer.
Sure.
And most of my early career was in finance.
Okay.
So kind of very structured kind of role, looking to almost enforce rules, if you know what I mean, because accountants are quite often the policemen inside big companies. The company at the time then moved the operation around about 90 miles to a new site. So I actually moved away from East Kent all the way to West Kent, which was about 60 miles away.
Okay.
And that's where I am now. But what I think was really interesting, it was experiences after that move in the way that Pfizer started to develop and evolve that started to increase my interest in futures. And this is the bit that really starts to lay out what's happened to me since. So part of the role that I had at Pfizer was leading the strategic planning process. Now, there's a bit of an oxymoron there, really, I think. When you work in strategy for an affiliate organization of a global entity, then one of the things that you have to understand is what is it that you have strategic control over, and what is it that they do in headquarters that they just tell you to do, and you need to get really good at doing as you're told. And frankly, we kind of struggled with that for a while.
Okay.
But what was really fascinating was that when we actually understood that what we had strategic control over was how we interacted with our customers and how we developed our talent, that gave us some context, I think, for thinking about, so how do we look at what happens in the external environment into the future? What are the potential futures we might see, and how might they impact what we do with our talent and how we as a business develop services that allow us to interact with our customers?
Interesting.
And it was through part of that I started to get involved more and more in futures work. We had a guy into the organization called Rohit Talwar who helped us develop a scenario planning exercise. We put the senior leaders of the organization through that exercise, develop a bunch of really interesting scenarios that we made kind of mock-up economist-type magazines from.
Interesting.
And that really resonated with me. I was just totally captivated by the idea that you can look at some trends, you can play those trends out into the future, you can create a number of different story titles and then put richness into those stories by looking at the number of the different of the factors that we've identified. What you can then do with those stories is apply those to your existing strategies and think about how new strategies could potentially evolve given those different potential outcomes.
Okay.
And for me, the real thing that I take from that point into everything that I do now is that futures work is not really about giving us a degree of comfort about one particular preferred future, but it's actually about allowing us, giving ourselves permission to develop robust, resilient, broad strategies that allow us to be flexible as we move our organizations into the future. Because the only thing we know for sure is what's happened.
Sure.
We don't know for sure, no matter what degree of sophistication we put into our projection and forecasting techniques. We don't know what's going to happen into the future. So how do we build flexibility and resilience into our organizations in order that we can cope with uncertainty and complexity in the future? And that's the piece that really interests me. That's what gets me up in the morning.
Interesting. No, I think that's fascinating. But before we maybe kind of continue, I think for people that may probably have heard the term kind of futurist, what exactly does that mean, or what does that mean to you?
Well, what it means to me is that I have a great interest in the future. Now, I know that sounds, blindingly obvious.
Okay.
But it's not just about the near future, potentially. It's not just about one future. So it's about looking to see what are the signals that we're seeing at the moment that take us toward the future. Now, some of those can be reasonably certain trends. Others can be really weak signals. And we kind of try to bring those together to create a sense of how different aspects of the future may actually evolve. And I think what's critically important is that the language that we use, certainly within Fast Future, is not things will develop, but things might develop, things could develop. Okay. There's a chance that we might see these kind of things. And it goes back to what I said just now. We don't know the future. We don't predict the future. What we do is suggest different potential futures so that people get a sense of the variability that's in the future, the complex nature of the future, the uncertain nature of the future. Because as futurists, I think we help people make sense of that. I think the other thing that we do as futurists as well is we help people draw connections between different disparate futures and the different disparate factors that drive some of those futures out. So a really good example of that maybe is I'm taking part over the weekend in an event talking about universal basic income.
Okay.
So if we think about universal basic income, the basic premise here is that there will be such a high degree of automation that we don't have the number of jobs that we do today. So how might that affect society? How might that affect the way that we live? So one of the ideas is that everyone has a basic income in order to survive, in order to live, in order to continue to play a full and proper part in society. Okay. Now that sounds a great idea, but then we start to think, so what are the implications of that? Do we mean universal basic income just in terms of cash, or do we start to introduce different services? What might those services be? Maybe it's free learning and education, because the one thing we know is as well as jobs disappearing from the economy, new jobs will come in as new technologies start to deliver the opportunity for us to create new businesses, to create new business sectors, to create new business models.
Totally. Yep.
So retraining could be a really significant element of that. But if we've got these kind of basic needs that we have, do we just give people cash, or do we provide access to other services? Do we provide free access to utilities? Do we provide access to free transport? Do we provide access to free broadband? So all of a sudden, the potential to provide appropriate basic needs broadens from just giving people a whole chunk of cash to help them live to providing a range of services that help them live. That then begins to question, so how are those funded?
Sure.
And the way that most of those would be funded would presumably be through the public sector. How do we fund the public sector? Through taxation. How do we need to change the way we raise taxation to fund those needs? But how do we then tax the people and the organizations that we currently tax in a fairer way to acknowledge what we need to do to create a fairer society if we don't have jobs for everyone? Do we start to, for example, penalize the use of robotics compared to those organizations that focus very much on employing people? Do we have an expectation that companies should provide funding for support for startups in new business sectors? So, all of a sudden, these kind of tentacles come out from the central topic that we started with. So, is universal basic income a good idea? To how fundamentally different it could potentially change the lives of everyone involved in that particular example. Then you start to say, well, is something like universal basic income and that funding model sustainable at a national level? What happens if in doing that we have to increase taxation in the UK to the extent that UK is not an attractive place for multinationals to do business? How do we then compete as a nation with the rest of the world that aren't necessarily looking at universal basic income? And if part of universal basic income is access to healthcare at zero cost to the individual, how does that challenge the existing US system?
Totally, yeah.
So there are lots of really interesting connections that I think futurists are pretty good at starting to form to help people make sense, not just of the issue that we started with, but also to understand the nature of the complexity and uncertainty that surrounds them.
No, I think that's fascinating to me. I'm actually quite interested about kind of that whole thing of kind of a base income for kind of everybody. I also wonder if it's kind of needed, if that, like, at some point, like you mentioned, new technologies will come out that everybody will be working. I obviously, I don't know, right? Like, nobody really has an idea. I think that at some point we're going to have some sort of basic income maybe, but I don't know if we'll necessarily need it. I don't know, right? I'm kind of on the fence, right? So it's...
And that I don't know is the absolute critical piece,
Okay.
because at the moment we see policy and strategy at the national level predicated on what I would say is a false assumption of security around the status quo. And I'll use the example of UK Prime Minister Theresa May's speech at Davos recently.
Okay.
So what she basically said was, technology is going to change the way we live our lives. So we need to think about new ways, new socially responsible ways for behaving, for example, on social media and the way that we use social media.
Sure.
The other thing that we need to acknowledge is that opportunities in these new technologies need to be addressed by a series of social system changes in the country. So in the UK, we want to become a centre of AI excellence.
Okay.
I think there's a bit of competition out there to do that, but that's the basic policy idea. What we'll do to underpin that is we'll create a vibrant startup type economy. We'll invest in training, we'll invest in education, and as the global economy grows and as AI plays a significant part in that economic growth, the UK will share in that worldwide wealth. Now, that, of course, is based on the assumption that what we see as current trends in economic change is going to happen into the future. Then we say, what if?
Sure.
So what if that doesn't happen? What if, for example, 3D printing makes everything so cheap to produce that the prices fall, that manufacturing can be done on a much more local level than it is now? What if there are issues around globalization that fall apart? What if nationalization really takes hold around the world? There are all these kind of potentially interesting macro drivers that could come to really challenge this notion about ongoing economic growth.
Sure.
So what we don't see, going back as well to the conversation that we had about universal basic income, if all these jobs are lost to automation, what we don't see is what if thinking. Now, what if thinking may be going on underneath the kind of the public pronouncements about what might happen into the future, how we might use technology, how technology will be an enabler to ongoing economic growth. But what if that doesn't happen? What if we need universal basic income? What's the process by which we start to think about entitlement? Where's the thinking where we start to think about how might we transition services that are currently available through private sector providers, even in the UK, back into the public sector so that we can start to maybe strip back some of the cost that at the moment is disappearing in terms of dividends and and profit, and the motive of making profit, in order that we can create sensible service levels for a universal basic income type world. And actually, do we mean anyway universal basic income for all, or do we want to use some of this increasingly sophisticated AI technology to take a slightly different view on entitlement?
Sure.
So, there's a whole bunch of things, I think, around uncertainty that we don't necessarily see when we hear governments talking about how economics may evolve and develop into the future.
Sure. So, no, I think I'm totally fascinated by it, but I'm curious to know what exactly is Fast Future Publishing, and you've written some books kind of with Fast Future. What exactly is Fast Future? And let's cover some of the books that you've written and some of the upcoming books.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Fast Future is a UK company, although we have people based in the US as well.
Very cool.
We basically do three things. The first thing we do, as you've mentioned a couple of times, is we publish books specifically about the future.
Okay.
And we currently have 4 books on the market. The first one was called The Future of Business. The second one is called Technology versus Humanity. That's written by a German author called Gert Leonhard, and it's basically his manifesto about how do we protect the world from the march of the machines and the march of technology. Then our last 2 books, one is called Beyond Genuine Stupidity, which is about ensuring AI serves humanity, and the most recent one is called The Future Reinvented, which is about reimagining life, society, and business. Now, the first book is basically the story of Fast Future, because the way that came about was, you remember a little while ago I mentioned this guy Rohit Talwar. He came in when I was working at Pfizer to help us with some scenario work. Well, I always kept contact with Rohit for a number of years afterwards, and after I'd left Pfizer, we were kind of chatting, and he said to me, I've got a really good idea for a book. I want to write a book with 25 or 30 contributors from around the world talking about different domains of the future that really interest them.
Okay,
but what I want to do is publish it in a slightly different way. I don't want to get into kind of the normal publishing model. And what made us say that was when we spoke to publishers about how long it might take to bring a book like that to market, they told us 18 to 24 months. And we thought, as futurists, by the time we take our ideas to market 24 months after we've written them down, they're probably old ideas.
Totally, yeah.
So we started to use our network to try to get out there, to try to call people up for content, to get their enthusiasm and their interest in contributing to the book. We ended up initially with 90 potential contributions, but
wow.
we managed to get that down to 60. So rather than the 25 to 30, we had a book that was more than double the size. So we had 60 contributors, 60 chapters from, I think it's 21 or 22 different countries around the world.
That's very cool.
Now, we edited that book in-house. We worked with a number of different production partners in order to bring the book to market. But from concept to publication happened in 19 weeks.
Wow. That's really fast, actually.
That is, it was very fast. We've tried to do that again. We've not quite made it, but we've been close. But the thing that we did was we really kind of challenged, I think, traditional notions about different process parts of the publishing process. So we looked very hard at the editing process, at editorial cycles. We looked very hard about the way that we engage team members into that editorial process. We used social media very extensively. No surprise there, I suppose.
Sure.
About promoting what we were trying to do. do. We used our own website in order to sell the book. We list on Amazon as well. So, we brought the book to market in a different way, but then albeit a same modern way, if you like, thinking about Amazon.
Sure.
So that kind of told us quite a lot about the interest in thinking about futures and in writing about futures. The other thing that we did as a result of that was continue to provide keynote speeches for both client events, for private client organizations, companies, for example. This is something particularly that Rohit had done in the past. And we started to realize that actually there was a really strong relationship between content from the book and the books themselves and speaking opportunities, which became and is now the largest part of our business.
Interesting.
The other thing that we both did before, and we continue to do now, again as a result of the research that we undertake in order to support both the speaking and the book development, is strategic consultancy. A lot of that strategic consultancy is very much focused around what is it that we're identifying and seeing from current trends to weak signals within a particular business sector. How can we help you within your business make sense of that? Can we possibly develop a workshop around engaging your colleagues within the business to make sense of this content so that they may build more resilient and more flexible strategies given the uncertain, complex nature of the future? So you begin to see how all these things tie together. So we have these three threads to our business right now. So we have the publishing, we have the keynote speaking, and we have the strategic consultancy.
Interesting. So I'm curious, though, I think this kind of covers kind of a bit deeper into what we've already been talking about. And you guys have been writing about this stuff and talking about it in your keynotes. Do we let kind of people or the general public or experts kind of decide how some of this technology should be used? Because like even something as simple as kind of, Apple's Siri and Google has Google Assistant and Alexa from Amazon, and there's a couple others. Samsung has their own. Like we're almost letting AI into our lives. Some people understand that, and some people I think don't really understand it. Some people don't care. I think some people are kind of freaked out by it. But like, in your opinion, how much should we kind of let maybe the general public, or should we leave it to experts, or should we kind of have a bit of both, kind of decide how AI can kind of become part of society?
I think it's all of the above. One of the things that I think has been really interesting about artificial intelligence as a technology is how it's really burst into the public consciousness.
Okay.
So, and I'm talking from a UK perspective here. If we look at how often stories about new technologies and specifically about artificial intelligence are featured in the lay media, then we've seen an absolute explosion over the last 18 months to 2 years.
Sure.
From daily newspapers, from the broadsheets, the tabloids, news websites, the BBC, both in terms of the BBC website, but also on their news programs. I've been on the BBC TV and radio talking about the potential impact on jobs and work of artificial intelligence. So the idea that artificial intelligence as a way to automate work is really come into the public consciousness. At the moment, I think it's very much there as a threat to jobs and as a threat to work, rather than an enabler for us to do different work and to change the value of work that we do. But I certainly think that as a new technology, AI has really emerged onto the public consciousness in the UK. Funnily enough, I mean, my mum talks about it to her friends as well. So she's got her friends talking about artificial intelligence and its potential. And my mum and her friends are kind of 70 and 80-year-olds. So it is coming into the public consciousness, and which I think has to be a good thing, because we do need a very open and public debate about how these technologies are used. At the moment, we're, I suppose, just on the cusp between reasonably harmless artificial intelligence, some may argue we've already gone beyond the cusp,
sure,
and artificial intelligence that can really be used for quite deceptive means.
Sure.
So I guess if we think about some of the controversies around how our personal data is used by artificial intelligence, if we think about some of the controversy about how much from the likes of the Amazon Echo devices, for example, are actually taken back and used by the tech companies. If we look at some of the developments that are ongoing in the way that we might be able to bring different data strands together to make different assumptions, to provide different services, some of that could be used for good, other of it not necessarily quite so good. We've only got to look at how artificial intelligence can be used by foreign agencies to wage cyber warfare on different countries. So, we need to have this public debate about how we use these new technologies. And if we look at how other new technologies are starting to emerge beyond artificial intelligence, so things like brain-computer interface, things like nanotechnology, things like 4D printing, there are a number of different technologies that are starting to emerge that could have such a radical impact on the way we live and the way that we work. We just need to think about, what do we want them to do? What do we want to be able to do with them? What is our choice as a society? Because unless we do something, then the profit motive remains the primary driver for bringing some of these things to market. That, and I suppose military applications.
Sure.
But neither of those motives are necessarily good for society. What we actually need to think about is, what decisions do we want to make as a society that allows tech companies to continue to bring these technologies into the marketplace? But then also, where's the off button for the artificially intelligent robot, so that we can make sure that the robots don't start taking all of our decisions and that we're able to make those decisions? So just because we can develop technology for a particular means doesn't mean we should do, and certainly doesn't mean that we should do without the appropriate controls that pay attention to society's needs and not just the needs of the tech companies. If we allow the tech companies to do that, then potentially, I'm not saying they would,
Sure.
but potentially we're into some of the kind of dystopian perspectives on the future that are technology driven, that we maybe see in science fiction films and movies.
Yeah, no, that's actually quite fascinating, to me anyway. And I think Apple was kind of the first one, kind of with Siri. That seemed to be kind of the most popular one. And I think recently, I would probably argue the Amazon Echo, and also kind of the Google Home Mini. I know, like, even my wife's parents, we got them a Google Home Mini because they wanted one, because we had one, and they were kind of fascinated by they could just like ask this little thing questions, right? And
Yep.
If you know them, they are not tech savvy people at all. And I don't mean it mean, it's just like
Nope.
I was absolutely shocked that they wanted one. And I was just like, wow, if somebody like that, and like their friends are starting to buy them now, and they're farmers, right? And again, I don't mean that negative. It's just they're not really known for being kind of tech savvy, and they wanted one, and now their friends are so I was like, wow, this has really kind of hit the mainstream, at least in kind of my immediate kind of friends and family. And I know some friends that have picked them up that aren't necessarily the most tech savvy either. So for me, it's like, it's already here, and how do we want to kind of figure out how to use it or not use it, right? And that's kind of fascinating to me. One thing you touched on that I don't know if the listener caught, you mentioned about 4D printing. That, to me, 3D printing is always fascinated me, but the whole 4D printing thing fascinates me kind of even more. What exactly is 4D printing?
Well, I think most people are probably familiar with 3D printing, so can kind of understand what it's seeking to do. I mean, I think people don't necessarily understand the broader implications from an economic and a manufacturing and a service perspective, but we'll park that for a second.
Sure.
So 4D printing is the creation, the use, the manufacture of materials that can change their properties. So materials that can heal themselves.
Sure.
Materials that can maybe let's take the example of a 4D printed heart valve that can maybe completely change the way that it operates dependent upon different conditions within the body. Maybe we can think about 4D printed clothing that would maybe change its shape, change its color, change its ability to be more airy based upon the ambient temperature around you. So this idea that materials can actually change their properties, and there's an incredible number of applications for this kind of technology, from road manufacture to clothing to healthcare, to fixing holes in things. It's just absolutely mind-boggling. So we're starting to see some really fascinating work happening in labs around the world about these materials, about new materials that can really change their properties based on a number of different conditions.
I think there's two things that always kind of fascinated me that I've kind of read about in the last couple of years that aren't necessarily on the 4D printing kind of space, but one was where they figured out a way to basically, like, if you get like a cavity in your tooth, that the tooth could like re-heal itself, because basically well, your body grew them at one point, so like why not just regrow the hole, right? Like, and I was like, oh, it makes a lot of sense. Like, but I think that I'm just trying to simplify it into something that people could probably understand, right? So if you don't have to go to the dentist to get your cavity filled anymore, and you just take whatever or however they do it, that's something that maybe the dentist can't provide anymore, and they only do other more complicated procedures, right? Or I've also read something where I think it was like Google was either working on or funding a company where they were basically building skin that could regrow itself and attach to your current skin. So for people with like burns or like burn victims or people with big scarring or just, you could fix this stuff and nobody would know whether you had, this kind of regrown kind of fake is kind of the wrong maybe word for it, but you know what I'm getting at, right? So
absolutely. So you're beginning to outline then just the breadth of applications for this kind of technology. I did want to take the opportunity just to touch on one thing that you said there that is really, really interesting. This idea that dentists all of a sudden might have to do more higher value work. I think this is an issue that's going to be replicated across pretty much every sector that we can think of. So one of the things that technology does, it commoditizes our products and services. So it's harder to differentiate. Now, we can see that increasingly, I think, in cars. So traditionally, if you like, there's been a kind of a particular brand of car that we might like, and we're particularly interested in that because the quality of the product is much better than others. But if we look at what's happening with the use of technology, that gap, I mean, there may be some brand equity there that still makes us prefer a BMW to a Ford, but the actual quality of the product, the gap is much narrower. So what technology forces us to do, I think, is to look at new value propositions, is to look at what kind of services we may actually be able to wrap around those commoditized products in order to differentiate ourselves from the competition. Now, we're also seeing that same thing happen in services, be it accounting, be it legal, and eventually I'm sure it will pop into consulting as well. So the more we commoditize services like products, the more we're going to have to think of new ways to create new value propositions around those more commoditized services that we bring to market. So I think that kind of dentist example is just a really small nugget of how we're going to see the world change with the use of technology.
Sure. No, that's interesting. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on something. Obviously, back in kind of grade school, we all learned about kind of how we went through the Industrial Revolution. And obviously we didn't end up kind of giving a base kind of salary or income to everybody. And obviously it changed kind of the face of how our kind of world is today, and it'll continue to evolve. And I kind of see this next maybe kind of, I think we're at the beginning of technology, kind of the technology boom or revolution or whatever, and it's already happening, but I think we're at the beginning. But I guess my question to you is we transitioned kind of from the Industrial Revolution, and we didn't kind of start giving people a base salary. Do you see that the technology revolution, we're talking about this base salary thing again, but it'll just be similar in the sense that like some people will be out of work for a while, they might have to retrain, but they'll be back working and society will kind of continue on? Or is it different or the same, or we don't know yet?
I suppose one answer is we don't know yet.
Okay.
Um, the thing that concerns me is when I hear people saying, here comes the fourth industrial revolution. The previous three industrial revolutions,
Sure.
we had, much as you'd outlined there, technology that comes along, that changes a particular sector, that starts to spin out other sectors, and we've continued to show increasing employment growth as the population has continued to grow as well.
Okay.
Now, I think we're at a slightly different point in time. One of the things you could argue about the previous three industrial revolutions is reasonable isolation about the new technological advances that were introduced. So whether it was the steam engine, whether it was electricity, whether it was
Sure.
desktop computing, reasonable isolation. So there were kind of periods of, oh my God, look, everything's changing. And then it kind of settled down a bit. And then there was another innovation, and I'm using the singular quite deliberately
Sure.
there, and then it settled down again. But let's just think about what I think of as the possibility explosion from all these exponential science and technology developments. So we've spoken about some of them, so 3D and 4D printing,
Sure.
Nanotechnology and autonomically precise manufacturing, AI, new computing architectures, hyper-connected internet of humanity, immersive experiences, mixed reality living, virtual reality, for example, cryptocurrencies and blockchain, synthetic biology, human augmentation, new technologies transforming healthcare, brain uploading, robotics, drones, new ideas around energy, food chain transformation. So there's a whole bunch of things that we're seeing at the moment. And I'm not sure we've quite seen that range of technologies
Sure.
coming together at one time.
Interesting.
So I don't think it's about AI in isolation, although it's obviously the technology that most people are talking about. But just start to imagine what AI could be like in combination with blockchain.
Yeah.
In combination with the use of autonomically precise manufacturing. I'll give you two examples of what of how radical I think this could be. One from the past. So we used to have a quite big device that we sat in the home for making telephone calls, and we used to have quite big devices that we used to call computers.
Sure.
And we used to think that when the telephone became a mobile telephone, that was quite game changing. But when we combined microcomputing with telephones, and we ended up with the smartphone, actually that allowed us to work in new ways. It allowed us to communicate in different ways. It allowed us to take pictures, to send text, to send movies, to consume that content in different ways and to work in different ways. So that has really quite radicalized the way that we've worked and the way that we've socialized over the last 10 to 15 years. I said earlier on that there was a fascinating example around 3D printing.
Sure.
So I'll give a really specific example. Local Motors is a US innovative company that 3D prints motor cars.
Okay.
It does that by printing something. One of the models is called a Strati. It's got 50 parts.
Wow.
The average family car has 5,000.
Wow.
So immediately we see actually the whole manufacturing process is very different. If we think about it at the kind of comparison in the number of parts, you don't need the same component supply chain sat behind it. Not only that, you can produce 2,500 cars in a Local Motors 3D printed car plant and break even. If you want to produce a Ford, then you probably need 75,000 units to break even through that plant.
Interesting. Wow.
Now, if you've then decide that you can manufacture locally, what does that do to logistics that currently supports the manufacturing great big global plants and the shipment of product all around the world? So your 3D printing Local Motors car is challenging current component manufacture and supply, and it's also challenging the logistics supply chains that sit behind that particular part of the business.
Sure.
The other thing that Local Motors have started to do is to combine 3D printing vehicle technology with artificial intelligence. And they've produced something called Ollie. Ollie is a 3D printed artificially intelligent autonomous minibus.
Interesting.
So you begin to see the potential when you bring some of these technologies together. I know we've always combined technologies in the plant. in the past. But I think those two examples with just one company really start to illustrate how fundamental new ways of manufacturing things with these new technologies could change not only those particular manufacturing sectors, but lots of related sectors around them.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. I think it's different than kind of the industrial revolutions we've had in the past. I think it's because, and this is obviously my opinion, is it's coming into every industry almost like at the same time, or like months or years apart, or has the potential to, right? And I think that's, to me, why it's different and kind of good or bad, right? And we won't know. It's just, it's kind of like, how quick did the phone, just like the smartphone, change basically business, right? And that's just like one small example, right? Well, it's a huge example, but it's kind of like
a huge change, small example.
Yeah, there we go. That's how you put it. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious, though, you've obviously written a lot of stuff on this. You talk about this all the time. What else should we as kind of a society kind of be thinking about, into the future?
Well, I think it's actually quite easy to fall into the trap of thinking that what we have is a problem around technology and the way that we use technology.
Okay.
I actually think the real issue is societal. And one of the reasons I think that is, first of all, we're going to have to change our idea of work, of the jobs that we do, the way that we work, the impact that has on the economy and so forth. And if we look, and I think it was some Pew research from 2014, 2015, looked at what a whole bunch of experts thought would be the future for work through automation. And about half the people surveyed said this looks a little bit like jobs Armageddon, and that automation and new technology will take out more jobs than new technology puts back. And therefore, the risk is societal unrest, societal breakdown, and increasing polarization between have and have not. The other half of the people that took part in that research said, actually, I have faith that human ingenuity will create jobs to offset those lost that exist within existing businesses and through existing technologies. And the new businesses that are established through the use of some of these new technologies will actually take up that slack. But we need new areas of social systems like education and training in order to prepare people for these new roles, for this new way of working, and for these new jobs. So whilst that says the jury's out on whether there will be jobs Armageddon or not, clearly there's agreement that there's a significant challenge for society to consider. Now, in kind of reinforcing that, I think from a business perspective, well, we're thinking, what is the mindset change that we need to make? Because if I'm sat in my existing business, then I can always do what I've always done. And that will always give me what I've always got, except increasingly, I don't think it will. So maybe I need to take a mindset that says, how do I create a new game? How do I do an Uber or an Airbnb in order to really create a new game and change the nature of the marketplace that I'm operating in? I think the big challenge there is actually about how do I change then the organizational DNA. So if I'm sat in a really big, existing, very successful multinational company, and we all know what happens with culture change in big organizations, how do we actually change the way that we become more flexible, the way that we address the marketplace, the way that we take new propositions to market? Because that needs a fundamental change in organizational DNA, the way that we think, the way that we engage with our consumers and our customers. I think at the same time, we're seeing an increasingly complex outside world. And I think what we'll start to see is what we think of as wicked problems becoming the norm. So in the past, we've had this kind of specialist area, if you like, where we're not very certain about what's going to happen. We're not very certain about how we address some of the problems and the opportunities. So we can kind of bring in some specialists now and again to think about how we resolve some of these wicked problems. Because actually, we've been able to agree on what we need to do, because we can make sense of the problems because they're near in. They might be a little bit tricky, but there's a degree of certainty. We can see the trends, we know how to handle them. So these kind of tame problems, which have been the norm in the past, I think will increasingly become the exception. So this idea about how do we handle complexity, how do we handle uncertainty, becomes increasingly important. And that feeds what I think of as a leadership challenge. And this leadership challenge exists within organizations. I think it exists within governments as well. So how do we build mindsets and skills that allow us to, for example, co-create new offerings with colleagues, with partners and customers? And I think there's a new skill set there. And I think part of that new skill set includes things like, how do we collaborate? How do we partner? How do we cope with complexity? How do we introduce a sense of curiosity? How do we accelerate our learning processes? Do we have enough of a tolerance of uncertainty, and how do we make sense of the things that we're seeing? Can we use foresight and scenario thinking to help us develop these robust and flexible strategies? But I think importantly, how do we then think about introducing empathy into the organization? Because if we start to look at what's happened for businesses over recent history, then maybe we've seen more masculine traits start to permeate what we do as a business. So how do we retain our strength? How do we get stronger? How do we grow? How do we beat the competition? Quite kind of masculine perspectives. But actually what we see going into the future is a need to be more collaborative, a need to be more empathetic with the people we're working with, both our customers, our partners, as well as the employees within our business. What are the kind of skills that we need to think of if we need to develop relationships, because commoditization of product and services has changed the nature of our value proposition? And actually what we can bring that's of more value to our customers and clients is more about relationship, is more about understanding, is more about empathy. So I think these things around mindset, around a new way of addressing and thinking about the problems and issues that we're faced with, and this new leadership challenge make me think that actually it's a societal issue. And that kind of goes back to the points that I was making earlier on, which is, as a society, how do we want some of these technologies to evolve and develop? How do we want them to be implemented? Who do we want to be responsible for them? Just because we can make a technology do something, should we allow it to do that? And how do we think about some sense of global agreement about how these things happen, so that we create a very human future rather than one that's dominated by techcos?
No, I 100% agree. It's interesting. I think the other thing that I'm curious to get your thoughts on, as we kind of get faster kind of internet or travel, whether, I know I've read stuff where if they build some sort of like aircraft that leaves Earth's atmosphere and kind of comes back down, you can be on the other side of the globe, within like an hour or two.
You mean like the ideas put forward for the Lapcat aircraft, which would be powered by reaction engines, dual rocket and air breathing jet engine?
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like, there's a bunch of companies, right? Like, they're actually kind of working on this, or multi-planetary, and some of this stuff sounds kind of really far-fetched, but I think a lot of this stuff is maybe like less than a decade or two away within our lifetime. And the thing that I'm trying to get at, I guess, is it would be completely fascinating if, you're in, the United Kingdom, but you say you work in LA or New York and you commute. And literally, you get up in the morning and you're in the UK and you end up in somewhere in America, and then you go home at night. And that's just like a normal thing, right? Like, that's pretty far-fetched, but it sounds like it's somewhat of a reality. And the point I'm trying to get at is, I don't really necessarily... The geographical borders has always kind of fascinated me. They don't really seem to make sense anymore. And I guess my question to you is like, as we're growing as kind of a society and humanity and even kind of business, and you've kind of touched on this throughout the show, is I think like we need to be talking more as like a global community than as like these separate countries, because we could potentially be living and working almost within hours of each other all over kind of the globe, potentially anyway. And you and I are in two different countries across an ocean right now. Like, I'm in Canada, you're in the UK. and it's like we're sitting next to each other. Nobody knows the difference where we are geographically located.
There's a whole bunch of things swimming around my head now after you'd said that. I suppose the one thing I'd start with is that this idea that we can commute many thousands of miles in a reasonably short space of time used to exist before Concorde was retired.
Sure. Interesting.
So,
yeah. We've already had it.
Yeah, and we know how that turned out.
Yeah, sure.
But equally, you're right. We do see increasingly propulsion and airframe technologies that allow some of these super quick times where vehicles would just pop outside the atmosphere and then pop back in again on the other side of the world. So this idea that increasingly fast air travel will be a part of the future is kind of one that's real, and I agree with you in terms of the time frame. It's really there now. The example I mentioned, reaction engines, they have test bed for these engines. The technology is being proven, and it's bringing in national and regional funding, and we're seeing other examples of those across the US and Japan particularly.
Sure.
I think for me, the other thing I'd say about kind of high-speed travel as well is within areas like the US, maybe Hyperloop can be part of that mix as well.
Interesting.
So it's not just about the air, it's also about what we might do on the ground. The other thing that I think challenges some of those notions about some of those flight technologies is how do they change the infrastructure that we might need for those?
Sure.
And we know how much infrastructure investment needed to happen just to cope with the Airbus A380 and its introduction for hub-to-hub flight in terms of bigger air bridges and so on. So there's a big infrastructure thing potentially on some of these new vehicle technologies. I think autonomous vehicles is another interesting thing. There was a survey that I saw, I think it was in Business Insider a while back, that said basically half of the airline pilots that were interviewed thought that their role could be overtaken by robots within 20 years.
Sure.
So as well as kind of speed, you've also got this issue about how aircraft would actually work. In parallel to that, we've got this whole bunch of new immersive technologies that actually ask us to question whether we need to travel. So at the moment, you and I, as you alluded to just now, don't need to travel to the UK or Canada in order for us to have this conversation. And that's a well-established technology.
Sure.
But what about things like augmented and virtual reality?
Yeah.
How do they potentially change the way that we might interact? How about holographic technology? Does that change the way that we might come together with a group of people in order to meet? What about increasingly the haptic technologies that allow us to also experience the physical things about close contact with people that may be on the other side of the world? What about some of the technologies that potentially allow us to feel a hotel's bed linen, to taste the food that's available in the restaurant, to smell the fragrances that are in the bathroom before we actually leave home? So there's a whole bunch of these kind of technologies that potentially travel our notion of needing to travel by fast air. I'm not saying they won't happen, but I'm saying that just the competition between technologies and the way that we experience what technologies have given us in the past may change in the future.
No, it's fascinating, right? You're right. The AI stuff, the virtual reality stuff, you never know. And actually, there's a local kind of room here that they kind of use VR, and they basically put each other in virtual reality into their meeting room, and the other ones, it's in Sweden? No, it doesn't matter. It's somewhere on Amsterdam. Sorry, it's in Amsterdam. And they basically have a VR room there, and we have a VR room here in Canada, and they basically have these meetings in VR all the time. And that's kind of fascinating, right? Because what's to say, like, is it kind of the same as having me physically there if we're both kind of physically there in VR? Like, I don't know, but it's an interesting kind of dynamic, right?
And I think there's a generational thing that plays through this as well, and it probably plays through most of these technologies. So but I'm a baby boomer, so I use some of these technologies, but I mostly enjoy meeting people face to face so that I can actually see them in the flesh and so on. If I'm a millennial, is that quite so essential as it is to a baby boomer? So if I'm working as a new young person and not the older person I am at the moment in business in 30 years' time, is it essential for me to travel around the world to see someone if I can use holographic technologies to bring us both together in a virtual space?
Yeah. We'll find out, I guess, right?
We were. I hope to be around to find out. But the other thing that I wanted to pick up on is this kind of virtual reality, because I think some of these technologies really challenge our perspective on what's real anyway.
Sure.
And is it okay to exist just in a virtual space as well as a real space? And one of the things that makes me say that is, I'm sure most people will have heard of Second Life.
Yeah.
A few years ago at its peak, it's kind of on the wane a little bit, I think, now.
Yeah.
But a few years ago at its peak, the internal economy of Second Life, where people traded products for predominantly for leisure, but also there were kind of training applications in there as well. The value of the economy was $500 million.
Yeah. That's
now
wild,
that was
right?
people trading virtual products, services, property.
Yep.
And I think that's interesting, because if there's that kind of interest in having a life inside a virtual world, what's real anymore?
Totally. Yeah, I 100% agree. It's wild, right? It's interesting.
Yeah.
But Steve, we are coming to the end of the show, so let's close with where people can get more information about yourself, Fast Future Publishing, and all the books we kind of talked about today.
Sure. Well, first of all, there's our website, which is fastfuture.com. You can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm called Informing Choice on Twitter. You can email me, steve@fastfuturepublishing.com. Or I'm sure if anyone wants to contact me via you, then I'm happy for you to pass on my details.
Perfect, Steve. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks very much indeed. Delighted
Thanks,
to be here. Thanks.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. To join the free community, buy some merch, sponsor the show, or sign up for the newsletter, please visit the website at buildingthefutureshow.com. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check him out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.